The camera was running when it happened. I was holding it myself, pointed uphill toward the rocky knob where our Rodman had gone to plant his rod and signal that he was on station. I watched what came out of the timber to his right. I watched it cross 40 yards of open ground in about 9 strides, and I kept filming because for those first several seconds, the signal my brain was receiving and the signal my hands were getting were two different things. And by the time they matched up, it was over. The tape ran for 17 more minutes after they disappeared into the spruce, recording nothing but the empty slope and the overturned rod and the mountain light coming sideways through the October aspens below. And then Ray put his hand on my shoulder and said my name, and I lowered the camera. The footage exists. The original mini DV cassette is in a fireproof lockbox in my shop in Challis, Idaho, where it has been for 18 years. I have watched it exactly 43 times. The count is precise because I began keeping it around viewing 15. When I understood I was going to keep watching it and went back and counted from the beginning. It does not get easier to watch. What it gets is more familiar, which is its own kind of hard. What you see on that tape, in 17 seconds of handheld morning light, with the audio picking up my own breathing going wrong, is a large, dark-haired, upright figure crossing 40 yards of open ground and taking a grown man off his feet and carrying him into the timber as if his 210 pounds required no particular accounting. That is where this story begins. It is not where it ends. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Gary Tolman. I am 62 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a licensed professional land surveyor in the state of Idaho. I spent the bulk of those years in the field, running survey crews as party chief, which in the profession means you make the calls. You read the terrain, you decide how to set up the traverse, you solve the measurement problems that come from working in country where the nearest known control point is on the other side of a drainage with no trail through it, and you are responsible for the accuracy of everything that goes on the certified plat. It is a job that puts you in the backcountry for weeks at a time and teaches you to think carefully about the places you are measuring, because places have character and character matters when you are establishing where one piece of land ends and another begins. I grew up in Haley, Idaho, in the Wood River Valley, and I went to the University of Idaho in Moscow and came out with a surveying degree and a hunger to be in the mountains that has never entirely left me. I started in the field with a transit and a steel chain and a hand level, the same tools the original government surveyors had been using for 150 years, and I learned the country from the inside, the way you learn a thing when you spend your working days in it. By the time I made party chief, I had run traverse in the White Cloud Peaks, GPS in the Lost River Range, and spent parts of 4 winters doing cadastral work in the Owyhee Canyonlands when the desert was cold enough to make the equipment stiff and the rock surfaces hard in ways that slowed everything down. I had also worked portions of the Lemhi and Salmon Ranges, the country between the Salmon River Valley and the Frank Church Wilderness, and I knew its character reasonably well. Dense timber at elevation, long drainages with no maintained trails past a certain point, country where the term remote meant something actual rather than scenic. I was not a man who startled easily in the backcountry. I was not a man with weak convictions about what was and was not possible in the wilderness of central Idaho. I held those convictions up until September 11th, 2006, and then I held different ones. In late August of 2006, I received a contract from the Bureau of Land Management's Salmon Field Office in Salmon, Idaho. The work was cadastral survey, a resurvey and remonumenting of original public land survey system corners in a 2-township area in the Upper Panther Creek drainage, Lemhi County. For those not familiar with the term, a cadastral survey establishes or reestablishes the legal boundaries of the grid laid across western public lands, starting in the 1800s by the General Land Office, the federal agency that sent surveyors into these mountains with compasses and Gunter's chains to create the framework of land ownership that still underlies every property boundary in the western United States. The BLM resurveys those corners regularly. Monuments get disturbed by equipment operations, buried by erosion, moved by decades of freeze-thaw cycles in high country, and rendered legally unreliable by the accumulated uncertainty that time produces. The Salmon Field Office needed a current certified plat for an area near the wilderness boundary that had not been officially re-examined since a previous cadastral survey completed in 1978. 28 years of weather and elk herds and occasional equipment traffic in the lower portion of the survey area. It was a reasonable assignment, and I had done similar work in the region before. My crew for that contract was 3 men. Ray Cutler had been my instrument operator for going on 9 years. A methodical, quiet, precise man in his early 40s, who had come to surveying out of high school and stayed because it suited him. Ray ran a Leica total station as some men drive a truck they have owned for a decade, without wasted motion, with an economy of adjustment that came from 10,000 hours of practice, with the ability to find a workable angle through obstructed timber when a less experienced operator would have declared the setup impossible. He was the best instrument operator I worked with in 31 years in the field, and I have known 23 of them. When I say he was the best, I mean it without the qualifications that accompany most superlatives. I mean it the way you mean it when you have seen enough of a category of excellence to know the top of it when you work next to it. The specific thing that distinguished Ray from the others I knew at his level was the absence of wasted motion. Every adjustment was the right adjustment the first time, or close enough to the first time that the difference was not meaningful.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
Phil Harker was my chainman and second Rodman, 26 years old that September. Raised on a cattle ranch outside Mackay, Idaho, and built in the manner that a decade of ranch work builds a young man, broad through the shoulders, with a physical endurance that field work demands and that some people have and some people do not have, and that cannot be taught to the ones who do not have it. Phil was steady and uncomplaining, and he moved through rough country without drama, and in 2 years with the firm he had not once cost me a day's production by being unable to do his part of the work. And Dennis Farlow was my Rodman. Dennis had been with me for 4 years by the fall of 2006. He was 33 years old, from a family in Chalice that had been running a livestock and ranch supply store since his grandfather's time. He had the quality that the best Rodmen have, which is a natural ability to read terrain and find what you are looking for in it before being told exactly where to look. A buried monument in a brushy creek bottom in country that has not been visited by a surveyor in 3 decades does not announce itself. You develop a sense for where the original surveyors would have placed it, what the terrain features they used as witness markers look like after 70 years of growth, where the disturbed soil from the original monument setting might still show as a slightly different color in the right light. Dennis had that sense. 4 years of working alongside me, not one lost corner. We were scheduled to mobilize from Chalice on September 8, 2006. The drive to the work area ran about 2 hours, south on U.S. Highway 93 to North Fork on the Salmon River, then west on the main river road to the Panther Creek Road junction, then roughly 14 miles up Panther Creek Road to the end of the section the Forest Service actively maintains, near the Old Mine Road turnoff for the Blackbird Mine complex. Beyond that point, the road becomes a primitive track requiring 4-wheel drive and patience. We had a 1-ton Dodge crew truck pulling a 16-foot enclosed equipment trailer, packed for 3 weeks of field work with the understanding that resupply would mean the full round trip back to Chalice. No casual runs to town. You plan your food and your fuel and your parts list, and you run the contract on what you bring. I want you to have an accurate picture of the country where this happened, because the terrain is not incidental to anything I am going to describe. Panther Creek runs west out of the Salmon River Mountains and flows roughly 40 miles before joining the main Salmon River a few miles south of the community of North Fork, Idaho. The drainage is in Lemhi County, one of the largest counties by area in Idaho, with a population that in 2006 was around 7,000 people spread across a territory larger than Connecticut. Salmon, the county seat, sits in the broad Lemhi Valley east of the mountains and has about 3,000 residents. Everything west of Salmon, in the direction of the Frank Church Wilderness, gets sparser and more remote the farther you go. With the human infrastructure thinning from the 2-lane highway at North Fork to the gravel of Panther Creek Road to the 2-rut track we were operating on, and then to nothing at all beyond the end of that track. The Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness itself covers about 2.25 million acres of designated roadless land, the largest such area in the lower 48 states outside Alaska. You do not work your way through it by following trails. You work through it by reading topographic maps and knowing the terrain and accepting that you will be wrong about the terrain at least once per day in ways that cost you time. The upper Panther Creek drainage, where our monuments were located, sits at elevations ranging from roughly 5,500 feet in the lower tributary drainages up to over 9,000 feet at the main ridge divides. The timber at the elevations where most of our monument work fell, 6,000 to about 8,000 feet, is dominated by Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, with lodgepole pine in the transition zones and whitebark pine near the ridge lines. These are not managed forests. They are old-growth and near-old-growth stands that have been proceeding on their own for centuries, with wind throw and beetle kill, creating an understory of deadfall and regrowth so complex in places that cross-country movement requires constant attention to footing and direction. The kind of forest where a man who steps 20 yards off the survey line loses visual contact with the instrument in seconds. The kind of forest where things live that have very little reason to involve themselves with people because people are not a regular feature of the environment. The Blackbird Mine Complex, also known historically as the Cobalt Mine, for the mineral it was primarily known for producing, operated in the lower Panther Creek drainage intermittently from the 1920s through the late 1990s. The mine extracted cobalt and nickel ore from deposits that were among the most significant in the country for those minerals, and the operation left behind a legacy of infrastructure and contamination in the lower drainage that the Environmental Protection Agency has been working on remediating for years, the heavy metals having leached into Panther Creek through the tailings. Above the old mine workings, the drainage has a different character entirely. The Forest Service decommissioned the access roads above a certain point in the late 1980s, and the alder and willow and young spruce have been reclaiming those roads since then with considerable enthusiasm. Our survey area was primarily above the mine works, in country that sees almost no human traffic outside of elk hunting season in October. Wildlife in the drainage was what you would expect for a remote area at this elevation with that kind of cover. Black bears in good numbers. I had seen digging and scat on the drive in the first day. Mountain lions, present but rarely seen, their sign more common than the animals themselves. Wolf packs working through on the elk herds, which were large that fall, the bulls beginning the first stages of rut behavior in early September. And in the upper basin near the wilderness boundary, the possibility of grizzlies coming south from the Frank Church country to access the high-elevation whitebark pine nut crop in a good mast year. That was the reason for the Browning A-bolt in .338 Winchester Magnum that I had been carrying on all remote Idaho jobs since a close mountain lion encounter in 2001. Phil carried it on the traverse days when we were working the upper survey area. It had lived in its case in the equipment trailer for every job on this contract up to the morning of September 11th. We arrived at the work site on September 8th. The aspens in the creek bottom had started to turn gold at the edges. The Engelmann spruce on the upper slopes were the deep blue-green of late summer, almost dark in the afternoon shadow. The creek was running low and clear over the gravel, that September sound a mountain stream makes when the snowmelt is long past and the water has settled into its late-season mode. We set up base camp on a flat section of ground beside the creek, about a quarter-mile past the last maintained road section, leveled the trailer, organized the cooking setup, and spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing the survey plan and doing an equipment inventory. Phil took a ruffed grouse on a late reconnaissance walk and made dinner worth eating on the camp stove. We sat at the folding table in the cooling evening air and talked about the traverse plan for the next morning and the condition of the road above camp, and nobody mentioned anything unusual because there was nothing unusual yet to mention. I slept well that first night. The creek sound at that elevation and that flow level is the kind that makes sleep easy. White noise with enough variation that the ear relaxes rather than tracks. Temperature dropped to the low 30s and the sky stayed clear. In the morning, the frost on the trailer was heavy enough that Phil scraped it with his forearm before loading the gear. I drank my coffee in the creek flat gravel, watching the light arrive on the ridgeline to the east, and thought about the day's traverse plan and nothing else. This is worth saying separately from what came after, because without it, without the quality those first 2 days had, of clean work in right country with the crew functioning the way a good crew does, what came after is just an event. With it, there is a before and an after, and the before was worth being in. Day 1 confirmed what I expected from the archival records and the pre-job reconnaissance I had done on the county plat maps. 3 monuments in the lower survey area, 2 in good condition with the original brass caps intact and measurable, 1 that had been partially disturbed, the iron pipe pulled partway out of the ground and left leaning, which I attributed to equipment operations near the old mine road that crossed close to that corner. Ray occupied the total station at the intermediate position. Phil and I worked the probe rod and metal detector around the estimated monument locations. Dennis occupied each point as we confirmed it, holding the Seco fiberglass rod plumb with the bubble centered, while Ray recorded the GPS position and total station angle. We knocked off at 5 in the afternoon with the day's planned monuments complete, a note in the field book about the disturbed monument's condition, and nothing else to report. Good production, good crew, good weather, nothing to notice. Day 2 was where it started. We moved into the upper portion of the survey area on the second morning, working a north-south traverse line through timber dense enough in places that we had to open sight lines with a bow saw to clear angles for the total station. This kind of work is slow. You cut as little as possible to preserve the forest, and you are constantly adjusting the instrument position to find angles around obstacles the saw cannot address. Ray was skilled at finding those angles without cutting, pulling setups from positions other operators would have dismissed. But it still cost time, and the traverse progressed in hundreds of feet per hour rather than the open country pace. It was while I was waiting for Dennis to reach his forward position on the traverse line that I found the tracks. He had gone ahead through the timber to mark the next instrument setup, and I was standing at the edge of a small tributary stream where our survey line crossed it, half thinking about the measurement geometry for the afternoon setup. The ground beside the tributary was the kind of dark, fine-grained, spring-fed mud that holds impressions the way good casting material holds a mold, and I was looking at it with the distracted attention of a man whose mind is on the next problem when the size registered. My boots are a size 11. The impressions I leave in soft ground are about 11.5 inches long. The tracks beside the tributary were 17 inches long and close to 8 inches across at the ball of the foot. 3 of them visible, heading from the western edge of the timber toward the water, in a line consistent with a bipedal gait, left foot, left foot, each landing as an individual impression rather than the front and back paired contacts that a four-legged thing makes at a stream crossing. The stride length between consecutive same-foot contacts was just under 5 feet. The depth was significant. The mud was firm enough that my own boot prints were 1/4 inch deep, and these tracks pressed down a full 1.5 inches. I know what a bear track looks like. I have seen hundreds of them in various substrates across 31 years of fieldwork in Idaho, and I have seen the specific error people make when they find a black bear's hind foot impression and convince themselves it is something else. A bear's hind foot is long and narrow at the heel, widening toward the toes, and bears produce visible claw marks and have essentially no arch structure. What was in the mud in front of me had 5 toes arranged in a fan pattern with the hallux, the big toe, showing as the heaviest impression, the outer toes decreasing in size in the human pattern. The arch was present and low, but structurally present. The heel impact was rounded and broad, the weight distribution showing the heel strike pattern that rolls from the outside of the heel toward the ball of the foot. The skin surface pressed into the mud showed a texture I could read clearly in the good morning light. Fine plantar ridges, the same dermal ridge surface you would find on the bottom of any human foot. On a foot close to 18 inches long, I got the camcorder out. I filmed each track from directly above and from the side. I placed my boot beside the clearest impression and filmed the comparison. I measured the stride length with my tape. I noted the direction of travel and found the timber margin at the western edge of the tributary where the track line emerged. The exit track line on the far bank continued on the same bearing. They had walked to the water, crossed it, and kept going east. I called Phil over first. He came and crouched at the mud strip and examined the tracks for about 30 seconds without speaking. He said, in the flat and specific way that Phil said most things, that those did not come from any man. Then he picked up his rod pole and went back toward the instrument position without elaborating. He was not the kind of person who needed to expand on an accurate statement, but I noticed that he carried his pry bar in his free hand for the rest of the morning rather than in his tool bag. Ray's response, when I showed him at the instrument position, was to note the location in the field book and suggest we keep working. I agreed with him. We had a traverse to run. Dennis, when I showed him during the lunch break, measured the stride himself and double-checked my tape reading. He looked at the direction the tracks had come from and asked if I had followed them into the timber to see where they originated. I told him we had monuments to find. He said he understood, and he stood and shouldered his rod bag, and he glanced back at the mud strip twice as we moved on up the line. That glance, twice, not once, was a thing I noted without saying anything about it. We ate lunch at the instrument setup. Sandwiches from the cooler in Phil's pack, crackers, 2 apples each, with the creek sound running below and the spruce canopy shifting slightly overhead and the mud strip with its 3 impressions roughly 30 yards behind us. No one mentioned the tracks during lunch. Phil ate steadily and methodically, as he did most things, without excess motion. Dennis ate quickly and kept his eyes on the south end of the traverse line, toward where he had come from, glancing at the tributary margin twice without appearing to decide to. Ray entered the morning's measurements in the field book with his standard economy, abbreviating what could be abbreviated, entering exact numbers for what required exactness. The field book notation Ray made that day said, bipedal impressions, unidentified, 17-inch by 8-inch, stride 58 inches, 3 impression sequence at tributary crossing, bearing northeast. Photographs taken. Not bear, not elk, not any recognized large vertebrate native to this drainage. He had not commented on it. He had simply made it, because an accurate field record requires entering what is observed. The afternoon traverse confirmed what the morning had established about the upper country. The north-facing slopes above 7,000 feet were dense enough in old-growth spruce that instrument setups came every 10 to 15 yards, rather than the 30-yard progressions we preferred in more open timber. Phil worked the bow saw when we needed sight lines cleared and worked it without complaint in the efficient way he did everything that required physical effort, the sawdust falling on his canvas jacket and not prompting a remark. Dennis occupied each forward station with the steadiness that had made him valuable on complex terrain from his first season, finding the line through the timber before we called it, holding the rod centered over each test position while we sorted out the geometry from below. By 4 in the afternoon, we had the planned traverse section closed and the measurements cross-referenced, and I was satisfied the day's production was defensible. We packed the instrument. I went back to the tributary crossing on the way down. The mud strip showed no new impressions. Whatever had made those tracks had come through once and not returned in the hours since. I photographed the strip a second time at close to 4 o'clock, the afternoon light coming from a different angle than the morning and showing the depth contrast more clearly, and added the timestamp to my field book. Then I stood for a moment at the edge of the mud looking at the timber on the far bank. The trees closed 15 feet in from the water, Old spruce grown so tightly that the interior of the stand was in full shadow at midday. Whatever had come out of that stand to the water and gone back into it could be standing in there right now at a range of 20 yards, and I would have no way of knowing it. I noted this fact the way a surveyor notes a measurement condition, without productive response, as a datum that exists whether acknowledged or not. Then I went back to catch up with the crew. That evening had a quality that distinguished it from the first evening in ways I noticed but did not try to articulate at the time. The same setup as the night before: folding table, camp stove, Phil cooking something hot that required no praise but received genuine appreciation, the view down the creek to where the drainage bent, and the last light was leaving the ridgeline. But the conversation was less. We covered the logistical content of the next day's traverse plan with efficiency and accuracy, and then the table went quiet in the way a table goes quiet when four people who work together well have each independently decided not to say the particular thing that is in the room. I ate and listened to the creek and watched the drainage darken from the bottom of the draw upward as the light withdrew, and I thought about the stride length between those impressions: 4 feet, 10 inches, perhaps 5 feet, and what the ratio of that stride to probable body height implied about the scale of the thing making them. And I put the calculation away when it arrived at a number I was not prepared to commit to in advance of better evidence. That evening, the first camp anomaly occurred. I had left the aluminum cover for the tripod case resting flat on top of the case beside the equipment trailer when we left for the field that morning. It was a rigid aluminum cover, gasketed, resting flat under its own weight with no particular breeze to move it. When I came back to camp in the early evening, the cover was 4 feet from the case, standing upright against the edge of the brush, oriented at an angle that would have required a specific and sustained wind from a specific direction to produce, and we had not had any sustained wind that afternoon in the drainage. I filmed the cover in its new position and filmed the equipment case and the surrounding gravel. No impressions in the coarse ground. I put the cover back and wrote a note in my field book: equipment cover displaced from tripod case. No wind explanation apparent. I did not say anything about it to the crew. Day 3 brought the smell. We were working a side drainage off the main creek, a narrow canyon with steep walls, and old-growth Engelmann spruce so close together on the north-facing slopes that the interior of the stand was in near dark at midday. The traverse was slow in that terrain and the brushwork was hard. We were about halfway through the planned line when the wind came from the north for 20 or 30 seconds and brought something with it. I have a working catalog of smells from 31 years in the Idaho backcountry. Fresh bear scat with the berry staining of summer, the urine and musk of elk in September rut, the iron smell of a fresh gut pile during hunting season, the sharp, faintly feline quality of cougar territory. None of those are what came with that wind. What it brought was warm and heavy and close, the smell of a large, warm-blooded thing, with a complexity below the surface layer that suggested an individual rather than just a species, and an earthen note underneath that told me something was spending significant time in deep timber at ground level. It was the kind of smell that the body processes as information before the conscious mind catches up. I stopped walking when it hit me, without deciding to stop. Phil had stopped too. He was 10 yards ahead on the traverse line, and he turned when I stopped and said, very quietly, "You smell that?" I said I did. Ray was at the instrument and gave no visible sign of registering it. Dennis was about 200 yards uphill from us, and I watched him stand motionless on the slope for a full minute, his face partially into the wind direction, before he turned back to his position and planted the rod and signaled for the shot. The smell was gone when the wind shifted after 30 seconds or so. It did not return that afternoon. But Phil worked closer to me for the rest of the day, and Dennis kept his offhand free rather than in his rod bag, and we ate that evening without much conversation and turned in early. After dinner, I walked the camp perimeter and pushed into the lodgepole timber on the east side of the clearing, about 60 yards from the trailer, and found something that I had not placed and no storm had made. 3 lodgepole pines, each about 4 inches in diameter at the base, had been bent and interlocked at roughly 8 feet height. Each trunk curved away from vertical in a long arc, the tops of the 3 trees crossing and resting against each other in a configuration that held them through combined tension. The result was a rough dome-shaped structure about 12 feet across at the ground. The trees were alive, the cambium showing pale and fresh where the outer bark had cracked at the apex of each bend, bending a 4-inch diameter lodgepole pine in a single sustained arc to that height requires more force than any person can apply without mechanical assistance. Doing it to 3 of them in a coordinated configuration requires applying that force in sequence while maintaining the geometry of the intended result. This was not wind damage. Wind does not produce organized outcomes. I filmed the structure from every accessible angle. I stepped inside it and looked up through the interlocked tops at the evening sky coming gray. The inside of the dome had a quality I did not try to describe in my field notes, but that has stayed with me clearly for 18 years. The quality of a thing made by a mind that understood what it was making. The structure served some purpose. Even if I did not know what the purpose was, it was too considered to be accidental, too specific in its form to be incidental. The professional vocabulary I had spent 31 years building was not particularly equipped for what I was looking at. I know how to describe terrain in the language field documentation requires: height above, datum, bearing, distance, relationship to established control. I do not have a standard notation for a dome structure built from live trees by a thing of unknown origin in old-growth timber 30 yards from a survey camp. I describe the geometry in the field book in purely dimensional terms: entry span, apex height, tree diameter at base, arc radius of each bent trunk, interlock geometry at the crown, and noted that the cambium was fresh and the construction was recent. I added the notation intent apparent and stopped there, because anything beyond that crossed from field observation into interpretation, and the field book was not the place for interpretation in a situation I did not yet understand. I stepped outside the dome and stood in the timber for a while. The spruce around me were entirely still. There was no wind inside the stand. Nothing moved, and nothing sounded that was unusual. Whatever had made this structure was not present in any detectable way at this moment, which was its own specific kind of information. What it had left was the structure itself, the product of real intention applied to real materials through real physical capability. 3 live trees, each 4 inches in diameter, bent in coordinated arcs to a common apex. I had handled enough timber and enough country to know what it took to produce that arc in a live tree, and I stood in the spruce dark thinking about that force and about the hands or whatever it was that had applied it, and about the fact that whatever owned those hands was somewhere in this drainage right now. I told Phil about it that night. He came and looked in the failing light and said he thought he had read something about structures like this when he was a teenager. He said he would not say the name of what he thought made them while standing in a forest in the dark. I said that seemed reasonable to me. After midnight, I heard the knocking. 3 impacts against wood, evenly spaced, coming from the eastern ridge above camp. Not a woodpecker. Woodpeckers work rapid and irregular rhythms and do not work after dark. These were slow and considered, each impact carrying the same force, producing a resonance that traveled down the drainage with a weight that told me the source was striking a large object, a standing dead tree or a heavy root mass, with real force behind it. The cadence was measured. 1, pause, 2, pause, 3, and then silence. About 20 minutes later, 3 more from the north. Different elevation, different timber, different tone from the impact, because the material being struck was not the same. But the cadence was structurally identical to the first set, the same measured 3 count, the same spacing between impacts. Call and response is the only accurate description. I lay in my bunk and listened to the exchange go back and forth across the drainage for perhaps 40 minutes Two positions communicating in the way that things communicate when they know where the other one is and have something to convey to it. Ray was awake. I could tell from the particular quality of his stillness in the other bunk, the held, listening quality of a man who is not sleeping. We did not speak that night about what we were hearing, and in the morning we made coffee and reviewed the traverse plan and did not bring it up, and the silence between us on the subject was its own kind of acknowledgement. We had both heard the same thing and reached the same conclusion about what it meant, and neither of us was ready to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would change the nature of the job in ways we were not certain we could manage. I did not sleep after the second exchange ended, sometime around midnight. The knocking stopped and the drainage returned to its baseline sound. Creak. The light movement of the canopy and whatever air was moving at ridge elevation, the occasional settling pop of dead wood contracting in the cold. But the normalcy that followed was different in texture from the normalcy before the knocking began. Normal sounds, made by things you can name, are one experience. The same sounds following an hour of back and forth between two dark positions on a ridge above your camp are a different experience at a frequency below conscious thought, a baseline readjustment your body makes without being asked. I reviewed the next day's traverse plan in my head instead of sleeping, which is not unusual for a party chief before a difficult day's work. But the traverse plan kept giving way to other calculations. The position of the dome structure relative to our camp and what the choice of that position communicated about awareness of our presence. The direction of travel in those tributary tracks and what terrain features in that direction a large upright thing would prefer for long-distance movement through this drainage. The eastern timber on the knob area and the density of the old-growth spruce there, and how long something patient and practiced in stillness could occupy that timber at the edge of an open knob without being visible from the instrument position 200 yards below. That last calculation was the one I kept coming back to. The eastern margin of the knob had been the backdrop of my line-of-sight documentation footage every day. I had been filming the approach to the knob from the instrument setup below. The camera pointed consistently uphill. The spruce margin, a dark band across the upper frame. What was in that spruce margin on any of those filming sessions was behind the frame rather than in it. And I had not thought about this during the filming because I had not yet had reason to think about it. I was thinking about it now. Ray's sleeping sounds were steady from the other bunk. He has always been a man who makes a decision and lives inside it without revision until evidence requires otherwise. And the decision he had evidently made was that the productivity of the next day's work required sleep, and so he was sleeping. I respected this and did not begrudge him it, and lay in the dark and listened to the drainage and thought about what we were going to do in the morning. Day 4 was September 11th, 2006. The plan for that morning was a cluster of monuments along the north edge of the survey area, a series of section and quarter-section corners marking the boundary between 2 blocks of BLM land at the margin of the Salmon Chalice National Forest. The survey line ran up a broad, west-facing slope above the main creek, climbing from open meadow patches at the lower monuments through alternating zones of timber and exposed rock to a rocky knob at about 7,200 feet elevation where the northernmost corner of the day's work was located. The knob was an island of rock and meadow ground in the timber, 80 yards or so across at its widest, with the spruce forest coming up close on the east, south, and north sides, the slope falling away open to the west toward the creek drainage below. From the monument on the knob in clear weather you could see the main ridge divide to the northeast and the long open slope dropping to the creek bottom. The monument itself was a glow corner from the 1912 survey, a sandstone rock mound with a brass cap set in the original survey by the federal surveyors who first established this section of the grid. I had located it on a reconnaissance 2 days before and confirmed its position against the archival field notes. The plan was to send Dennis to the upper monument early, while Ray and I were still setting up the instrument at the intermediate position below. Walking time from our instrument setup to the knob was about 20 minutes across the slope. If Dennis was on station when we were ready to take the shot, we progressed efficiently. Phil would work the lower monuments in the portion of the survey area below our setup and work his way up to join us by mid-morning. Standard leapfrog operation. Standard crew coordination. The kind of plan we had executed hundreds of times across 11 years of working together. Dennis took his Seiko rod, his field bag, his radio, and his orange survey vest worn over his brown canvas jacket, and started up the slope at 7:40 in the morning. The temperature was 38 degrees, and the aspens in the creek bottom were fully gold. The low morning light from the east was coming in at an angle that caught the aspen leaves and made them look lit from the inside. I remember noticing this specifically. The kind of morning that reminds you why you chose a job that required you to spend your working life in these mountains. I have thought about that specific thought many times in the years since, because of what it was the last thought of before everything changed. I had the Sony camcorder running for the uphill traverse because I wanted documentation of the line-of-sight relationship between the intermediate position and the knob monument, and the approach terrain. This was standard practice on my contracts. BLM documentation included photographic records of site approach conditions and the sight lines between instrument positions and occupied monument points. I had done it every day on this contract. The camcorder was recording when Dennis reached the knob. I watched him through the zoom find the monument, slow as he searched the rock cluster, locate the brass cap, plant the rod, square himself over the point, and turn downhill to face me. The timber on the east side of the knob was old-growth Engelmann spruce. Large trees, close together, their lower branches heavy and overlapping. The interior of the stand in deep shade, even at that hour, because the canopy was too dense to admit much direct morning light. The timber margin came up within 40 yards of the eastern edge of the open knob ground where Dennis stood. 40 yards of open ground between the timber and Dennis. I am going to describe what the footage shows and what I saw in real time as precisely as I can, because precision is the only thing I have to offer on a subject where the temptation is always toward embellishment. The figure appears in the footage at 23 minutes and 14 seconds of recording time. It appears at the left edge of the frame, at the eastern timber margin of the knob. It is upright from the first frame, fully upright, the head elevated and the back straight, the arms moving in the natural opposition to leg movement that belongs to efficient bipedal locomotion. This is not the low forward posture of a bear crossing open ground. It is the centered, vertical posture of a being that walks on 2 feet as its primary and practiced mode of travel. I had the GPS coordinates of the monument Dennis was occupying and the known position of the previous backsite monument, which gave me actual measured distances to use as scale when I analyzed the footage later. The figure's stride length, estimated by scaling against those known reference distances, was between 5.5 and 6 feet per full stride, 9 complete strides from the timber margin to Dennis's position. Elapsed time across those 9 strides, 17 seconds on the footage. 17 seconds, 9 strides, 40 yards. That is roughly 35 feet per second, which works out to close to 24 miles per hour. This is not the speed of a running form. It is the speed of a figure walking with strong purpose. The hair was dark brown going to near black in the shadow of the spruce canopy above the knob, the color of wet charcoal. Almost black in direct observation and purely black in shadow. Dense and close to the body, the way a healthy coat lies in autumn when it has fully come in for the cold season. Not the reddish or auburn tones that appear in older footage that has been in circulation for decades. Close to black, uniform across the full extent of the figure from head to lower body as far as I could see. The shoulders were wide. I say this knowing that scale at 600 yards through a consumer-grade zoom is not perfectly reliable. But I had a reference point. Dennis Farlow, whose chest and shoulder dimensions I knew from crew safety paperwork. 6 feet 1 inch tall, 210 pounds. Shoulder span about 20 inches. The figure crossing toward him was taller. My analysis of the footage put it at 12 to 15 inches taller. and wider across the shoulders in proportion to that height, with arm length relative to torso exceeding the normal human ratio. The arms were longer than they should have been at that height. Not extreme, proportionally wrong in the specific way that appears in older cryptid footage, the arms hanging slightly long at rest, swinging with slightly more arc than human arms do at speed. At 7 strides, 2 strides before contact, a detail appeared that Ray found on the third viewing in frame advance mode and that I have thought about more than any other detail on that tape. The figure slowed for about 2 seconds, the speed dropping to maybe 2/3 of its approach pace. And in those same 2 seconds, Dennis's posture changed. His head came up and turned roughly 45 degrees to his right, toward the approach. He had heard it or seen it in that moment, and he turned to face it. And in those same 2 seconds, the figure's course shifted. The bearing changed from a direct interception line, an angle that would have brought it to Dennis from directly behind, to an arc that would bring it to him from the side, from his right quarter, putting itself into his field of vision rather than approaching from his blind side. A course change, executed at the precise moment the other party acknowledged the approach. I have tried to explain this with every framework available to me over 18 years, and I cannot do it without using the word intention. Predators do not adjust their course when prey becomes aware of them. They rely on awareness not being established in the first place. What the footage shows is not predatory behavior. It is the behavior of a being that wanted to be seen coming. The audio on the tape catches my breathing in the seconds before contact, not the steady rhythm of a man doing documentation work. The short, shallow pattern of a person whose respiratory system has received information it is working to process. You can hear it clearly on the tape, and it sounds exactly like a man who is watching something he cannot explain, still doing the only thing his training gives him to do in response to the inexplicable, which is to keep the camera running. There is no impact sound. The 2 silhouettes merge on the footage, the figure arriving at Dennis's position and the 2 silhouettes becoming one, and the audio does not record anything that sounds like a collision or a fall or a cry. The combined form moves toward the eastern timber in 3 long strides, covering the 40 yards from the monument to the tree margin in 4 to 5 seconds, and then the old growth receives them, and the footage records 17 more minutes of the empty knob and the overturned rod and the morning wind in the spruce canopy. The audio records my breathing for about 3 of those 17 minutes, getting steadily slower. It records Ray saying my name once. After about 15 minutes, it records the sound of my boots on the rocky ground when I finally turned. And then the recording ends because I lowered the camera. I called Dennis on the radio 5 times with 15 seconds between each call. Open carrier each time. His radio was on. The circuit was complete, and he was not pressing the transmit button. 5 calls. 5 periods of silence, which were their own kind of information. Ray had not seen the approach. His line of sight to the knob had been blocked by the instrument body at the critical moment, and he had been working a fine adjustment on the trebuchet. He knew something was wrong from the radio calls, and from my posture when he looked up. I told him what I had seen in about 2 minutes of flat, factual language. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Is he alive?" It was the right question and the only productive one. And I told him I did not know. He said, "Then we need to go up there." Phil reached us 12 minutes later, drawn by the radio traffic. He had been at the lower monuments with his radio in his hand when the first call to Dennis went out. I explained the situation in about 2 minutes. Phil listened without expression. When I finished, he said he was going up there, and he picked up his rod bag and was already moving before Ray and I had fully reacted. I had the Browning off my shoulder and a round chambered before we left the instrument setup. The knob surface, when we reached it, told a quiet and specific story. The monument was exactly where it should be, the brass cap undisturbed, the rock mound stable, the old witness tree blazes intact. The Seco rod was on the ground at the monument, its heel at the brass cap and its tip pointing downhill. in the position a rod makes when it has been set down from a standing position by someone occupying the point and facing downhill. Not thrown, not dropped in a fall. Set down in the specific angled manner a person sets a rod when releasing their grip. The scuff marks in the thin soil at the eastern edge of the knob rock were not deep, not the gouge of a fall or a pursuit, but present, the kind of marks a boot sole leaves when the foot pivots on uneven ground with urgency. I followed the timber margin north and south, looking for the point of entry into the stand. About 12 yards south of center, 3 lower spruce branches showed fresh breaks on their interior faces. Green wood, sap still running, at heights between 4 and 7 feet off the ground. A form had moved through the canopy edge from inside the timber outward, fast, breaking those branches on the way through. The breaks were on the inside face, which meant the force had been directed outward, from the interior of the stand toward the meadow, not a person pushing in from outside. What came out? I photographed the breaks. I filmed the monument and the meadow and the timber margin. Then I got on the satellite phone and called the BLM Salmon Field Office. Patricia Wells, the field office coordinator, was professional and quick. I described it as a crew member who had left the survey point, failed to respond to radio contact, and appeared to have entered a dense timber stand following what I was describing as a wildlife encounter. I chose those words for the specific reason that they would produce the fastest response without requiring me to describe what I had seen in terms that would have caused a different kind of conversation. Patricia transferred me to the safety coordinator, and search and rescue was notified within the hour. Phil sat on a rock at the meadow margin and did not move for close to 2 hours and did not speak. I understood it. He was 26 years old and he had built his working life on a set of concrete assumptions about the world. And those assumptions had been pulled from underneath him in the space of a morning, and the replacement framework had not arrived yet. The gap between what he had believed an hour before and what he was now required to believe was wider than any adjustment I could help him make, so I left him alone and let the gap close at its own pace. The 2 hours between the satellite call and the deputy's arrival were their own kind of difficult. We were on the knob in the September cold, mid-40s by my estimate, dropping as the afternoon progressed, with the instrument in its case and the day's work suspended and nothing to do that was of any use. The open ground of the knob gave us a clear view in most directions, but the eastern timber was a wall, the old-growth canopy too dense to show anything inside it. And my eyes went to that wall repeatedly, with no result. I had watched it enter that timber with my Rodman in its arms, and the timber had closed, and the timber had stayed closed, and I had no information about what was happening inside it. That not knowing is a particular variety of bad that I would recommend no one seek out. I walked the knob perimeter twice, staying 10 feet from the timber margins. On the south margin, I found what appeared to be a partial impression in the thin soil at the edge of the rock, the heel strike of a large form, consistent with the width of those tracks in the tributary mud, though the rocky ground held it poorly and I could not get reliable measurements. I filmed it. I photographed it with my backup camera. Then I went back to the center of the knob and stood with my hand on the browning and the open slope below me and the dark timber behind me, and nothing to look at and nothing to do about it. The weather had been clear all morning, but a line of cloud was building to the north above the Frank Church country, the kind of high-pressure transition cloud that comes in ahead of cold fronts in this part of Idaho in September, and that can turn a functional field day into a miserable one inside 3 hours. I noted this in my field book because I noted field conditions in my field book on every working day of my career. And this was still a working day even if the work had stopped. The discipline of recording observable conditions when everything around you is unraveling is not a small thing. It gives the mind a task that is bounded and executable and that produces something concrete, and concrete things are useful when everything else is going in a direction you cannot follow. Ray organized. He inventoried the equipment cases, secured the instrument in its carrying case, reviewed the field book for the day. He inventoried the equipment cases, secured the instrument in its carrying case, reviewed the field book for the day. He brought me a cup of coffee from the thermos in his pack, and we drank it standing at the monument, looking east into the spruce stand and saying very little. He walked to the edge of the knob periodically and looked into the drainage below as if he might see something useful. He could not see anything useful. Neither could I. But doing something purposeful is its own form of managing a situation that does not respond to purpose, and Ray understood that. The first deputy from the Lemhi County Sheriff's Office arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon. He had driven the Panther Creek Road as fast as the road permitted, and then hiked the trail to camp, and then up to our position. And he was sweating despite the September afternoon chill when he reached us. He was methodical and professional. He took separate statements from all three of us, moving between us with his recorder and his notepad. And the three statements aligned precisely on every detail, because there was only one way it had happened, and we described it the same way independently. When I finished my account, a large, upright, dark-haired bipedal figure, between 8 and 9 feet based on comparison to the reference height of my Rodman, covering 40 yards in 17 seconds, making contact with Dennis at the monument and moving both of them into the eastern timber. The deputy stopped writing and looked at me for a moment. Then he wrote something down and keyed his radio. He did not tell me I was wrong or confused. He asked me how many crew members I had with me, and he confirmed the 3 separate accounts, and he called Lemhi County Search and Rescue. SAR arrived before 5 o'clock in 2 vehicles. The team coordinator, Vonda Noakes, along with a German shepherd named Kodiak trained for backcountry tracking, 2 additional deputies from the sheriff's office, and 2 experienced volunteer searchers. 8 people total, including Ray and me. Vonda ran her team with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this work in this terrain for a long time and did not need drama to function. She put Kodiak on the track at the timber margin where the broken branches were. The dog went into the spruce without hesitation, head down, lead taut, moving at a fast walk that covered ground with the certainty of a trained tracking dog that has an unambiguous scent to follow. We went in behind him in single file, pushing through the old-growth interior in the green-gray afternoon light under the canopy, watching our footing on the duff and the exposed root systems. The track led through the spruce stand for about 300 yards before the stand opened into a rocky draw running northeast below a talus field under a cliff line. The talus was granite, angular blocks from a fault fracture in the cliff above, piled in the variable sizes that gravity and time produce, ranging from shoebox to car-sized. Kodiak followed the base of the talus northeast rather than climbing it, moving steadily. About 700 yards from our entry into the stand, he stopped, sat, and looked at Vonda. Then he looked at the timber between the lower talus edge and the cliff base, a zone of large spruce growing directly against the rock face, their roots more in the cliff cracks than in any soil. I heard Dennis before the lead deputy cleared the tree line into that zone. A single breath, long and controlled. The exhalation of a person who has been managing their respiration carefully for several hours and is good at it. The deputy pushed through and I was directly behind him. And Dennis was visible immediately. He was sitting against the base of the largest spruce in the zone, a tree whose trunk was wider than I could reach around with both arms. His orange survey vest was still on. His field bag was beside his right knee. His face was tilted slightly upward, toward the cliff above, and for 3 or 4 seconds the posture read as unconscious. Then he turned his head and looked directly at me and said, in a voice that had no tremor in it, "Close the timber. Don't let the dog in." I turned to Vonda and said, "Please." She hesitated. Her professional protocols told her the site was hers to manage. I said, "Please," again. She held Kodiak outside the tree line. I crouched beside Dennis and put my fingers on his wrist. 70 beats per minute, strong and steady. He was present, oriented, fully conscious. His left shoulder was elevated slightly and held slightly forward, the posture of a shoulder managing deep bruising rather than a break. And when I pressed it lightly, he pulled away. I told the deputy to request medical transport and to note possible shoulder injury. Dennis put his hand on mine and said, "Not broken. I would know." He was right. The emergency room at Steele Memorial Medical Center in Salmon confirmed later that evening a deep contusion over the left scapula and posterior shoulder joint, the bruise covering close to 12 inches across and pressing 3 inches deep at the center. The attending physician noted that the contact pattern was unlike any fall injury and consistent with a grip from a very large contact surface. I asked Dennis if he could walk. He said he could walk to Salmon if he needed to. Then he said he needed a few minutes, and there was something he wanted me to understand before we got into the company of a lot of other people. I asked the deputy and Vonda to give us a moment. They gave it to us. Dennis looked at me and said, "I was not hurt on purpose." He said it with the deliberateness of someone who had spent several hours in that hollow deciding which sentence to lead with, and that was the one he had chosen. Then he said, "It was curious." That is the word I keep coming back to. It was curious about me. Dennis told the full account 3 times in the weeks following the incident. That evening at Steele Memorial, again during the BLM safety investigation, and a third time 6 weeks later when I drove from Chalice to the feed store and sat with him in the back room for 3 hours, with the alfalfa bag smell in the air and no interruptions. All 3 accounts were consistent in every detail, every specific, every qualifier. He is not a man who adds to what he saw in order to make it more interesting than it was. The grip came from behind and from above, at the level of his upper arms, both arms pinned against his sides in the same instant. It was large enough that whatever held him had significant span across the front of his torso as well. Not merely a hand on each side, but a spanning hold that required a reach considerably beyond anything a human arm could produce. He could not see it from that position. He did not struggle. And he was specific when I asked him about this. The lack of struggle was not a decision he made. His body produced no struggle response. The hold was firm and total and did not hurt him. And he compared it to being secured by a grip that understood the precise force required and applied exactly that force and no more, with the clear sense that more was available and was being withheld. He was carried, not dragged. He was specific and emphatic on this point across all 3 accounts, and the footage confirms it, because nothing of that size dragging a struggling or limp body through old-growth spruce at that speed moves with the smooth efficiency that the figure showed in those final 3 strides. His feet were off the ground. He was carried in a position that turned him partially sideways relative to the direction of movement, which he believed kept the larger branches from striking his face directly. He could not accurately judge the transit time. He estimated 3 to 5 minutes. He lost track of time the way you do when you are not in a state that allows you to count anything. He was set down with care. His feet reached the ground first. His weight was settled back onto them. Then the hold released from around his torso, and he stood in the hollow between the talus base and the cliff and got his balance and turned around. The creature was 8 feet from him, crouching, not sitting, crouching in the athletic sense. Weight on the balls of the feet, elbows on knees, back vertical from the hips. The posture put the top of its head at Dennis's eye level roughly, which told him that standing it would be 12 to 15 inches taller than his 6 feet 1. It had positioned itself in front of him in the seconds between the release and his turn. He had not heard it move. He spent a long time on the face, across all 3 tellings, because he was aware that the description would be weighed against every prior account, and he wanted to be as accurate as possible. The brow ridge was heavy, more pronounced than any person he had ever seen, significant enough to be the first thing you noticed in the facial structure, but not the extreme anatomy of ancient fossil reconstructions. More like the brow of a man with a particularly pronounced supraorbital ridge, but heavier, substantial enough that it cast a shadow over the deep-set eyes beneath it in the dim light of the hollow. The hair on the face was shorter and finer than on the body, thinning around the eyes enough that the skin beneath was visible. The nose was broad and flat, the bridge low, the nostrils wide, the jaw was wide and heavy, the chin defined. The ears were small relative to the head and set lower and farther back than human ears are set. The eyes were large and dark brown and clear, not the flat, reflective opacity of a purely instinctual eye. Clear in the manner implying active cognitive processing, the quality you see in a human face when someone is engaged with what is directly in front of them. They were focused on Dennis with a steadiness he described as not threatening, not neutral, not submissive. He used the word studying. It was studying him. He said he recognized the quality of that attention because he had been studied before by people and occasionally by animals in the field, and this had the quality of the former rather than the latter. It was the attention of a mind gathering information in an organized and intentional way. He noticed the field bag before the creature noticed him looking at it. The bag was on the ground at the edge of the hollow, retrieved during the transit and placed there. The creature looked at the bag, then at Dennis, then back at the bag, then it reached and picked it up in one hand. Dennis was careful about the hands in the way he was careful about the face. They were large in proportion to the body, broad across the palm, with fingers that were thick and long relative to the palm, with a span he estimated at close to 14 inches from thumb to little finger. They moved with a precision he had not expected at that scale. Individual fingers working separately on the exterior of the bag, examining the webbing handle, pressing the reinforced corners, turning the bag to examine each face. 3 minutes on the exterior before the fingers found the zipper, and then 5 minutes on the zipper alone. Dennis almost laughed during the zipper examination and stopped himself, because he was not sure what laughter would communicate, and he was being careful about everything he communicated in that hollow. But he said the engagement with the zipper was the engagement of a mind encountering a mechanism for the first time and finding the mechanism itself worth understanding. The way the 2 rows of teeth mated and released, the sound of the operation, the resistance of the pull tab at each end. The pull tab was worked in both directions multiple times. The sound was attended to with what he could only describe as acoustic interest. This was not instinct trying to open a bag. This was an investigation of the zipper as an object of interest in its own right. When it opened the bag and removed the contents, it placed each item in a line on the flat rock beside it. The granola bar, a Nature Valley oat and honey bar, still in its foil and plastic wrapper, received the longest examination. It held the bar for several minutes, turning the wrapper in those broad fingers, pressing the contents gently, holding the bar close to its face, and appearing to inhale. Dennis said the nostrils moved with a quality suggesting the smell was specific and informative rather than merely present. The same attentive use of scent that he had seen skilled hunting dogs apply to a new object, functional rather than incidental. Then the bar was set down on the rock. Not opened. Set down. Dennis relayed this detail with the care of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about it. He said if what he was dealing with had been operating on hunger or opportunism, the bar would have been consumed in seconds. Setting it down without opening it was a choice made by a being that had decided eating the bar was not the point of the examination. He had become an object of study, not a resource. The distinction between those two things was, he said, the clearest communication of the 2 hours, communicated not through any gesture or sound but through what was not done and the specific significance of not doing it. The items were replaced in the bag in the reverse order they had come out, each one placed with care. The rain jacket last because it was the largest and the last removed. The zipper was closed. The bag was set beside Dennis's right knee. Then it made a sound, a single tone, low and sustained, originating from the chest rather than the throat, lasting about 2 seconds. Dennis felt the vibration more than he heard it, in his sternum and in the air between them. He compared it to the lowest register of a pipe organ heard from directly beside the instrument rather than from across the room. A physical sensation that arrives as sound, the kind of low frequency that registers in the body before the ears process it. He did not interpret it as a threat. He did not interpret it as any specific message. He said his body responded to it with a reduction in alertness rather than an increase, which he could not explain, but could report accurately. After about 2 hours, he had tracked the time roughly by the quality of light coming into the hollow from the cliff face above, which shifted as the afternoon progressed. It stood, one fluid motion from crouching to full height, taking about half a second, and at full height it occupied the overhead space in the hollow, making accurate assessment of scale impossible, the way very large things in enclosed spaces defeat the brain's normal calibration for distance and dimension. It looked at Dennis once more. This final look, in all 3 accounts, received the same language from him, the look of a being that has completed what it came to do and is marking the completion. Not a threat, not a dismissal, a conclusion. Acknowledged. Then it climbed the talus above the hollow. Fast and certain on the angular granite blocks, the sureness of a being entirely at home on that terrain, not scrambling or cautious, but moving with the fluid confidence of a being that has spent its life on exactly this kind of surface. He heard it on the rock for the first 12 or 13 vertical feet, and then the sound stopped while it was still visible on the talus. He could see the talus. The figure was not on the talus. It had ceased to produce sound in the way that large things in familiar terrain can stop producing sound when they choose to, without transition, without fade. One moment there, gone. He sat against that spruce for close to 40 minutes. He heard Kodiak somewhere below in the draw. He stood up and walked toward the sound. That evening in the motel in Salmon, Ray and I connected the camcorder to the room television through the AV cable I carry in my kit bag and watched the footage. We watched it 5 times. On the 3rd and 4th viewings, we worked through the incident portion in frame advance mode, using the camcorder's step function. Ray had his notepad and was writing, which is how he has always processed events that exceed his working framework, by reducing them to documented data points, each on its own line, each attributed accurately to what was visible on the tape versus what was inferred from it. His notes from that night are in the lockbox in my shop with the tape. They are precise and without sentiment, and they end with one sentence. Not a bear, not a man, not anything in the reference library. Alive and purposeful. I watched the footage with particular attention to the course adjustment at 7 strides, which Ray had caught first. I watched the figure's approach arc shift in the moment Dennis turned to face it. I watched it multiple times and I could not find a reading of that 2-second course change that did not involve awareness of Dennis's awareness, and a response to that awareness, and a choice made in response to that response. A predator does not modify its approach when prey becomes aware of it. Instinct does not modify its course based on the behavior of the thing being approached. What I watched in those 2 seconds was not predatory behavior and was not instinct. It was the behavior of a being that had a reason to want to be seen coming rather than arriving unseen. The BLM safety officer arrived the following morning. His name was Ken Dower, from the Idaho State Office, and his primary concern was the workers' compensation file and the incident documentation. His report described the incident as a probable bear encounter resulting in brief crew member displacement and minor physical injury. Probable bear appeared in the report 3 times. Dennis's bruise was described as consistent with a fall during the period of disorientation. No one at the field office questioned this characterization in writing. When Ken Dower asked me whether I had any documentation footage relevant to the incident, I told him I had footage of the morning's monument work, but had not been recording at the time of the incident. I said this before I had fully decided to say it, and afterward I did not unsay it. I have thought about that choice for 18 years. The most honest accounting I can give is this. I made a calculation about what the footage would be worth in the world, against what it would cost, Dennis and the drainage, and whatever lives in it. That calculation has not resolved in 18 years. I watch the news about wildlife research and drone surveys and remote camera programs in the backcountry, and I understand every argument for the value of documentation. I also understand the difference between a wild population that has survived through the specific advantage of not being cataloged and what happens to that advantage the moment the catalog begins. The agencies that have access to information like what is on that tape have not elected to share it publicly. And whatever that institutional silence costs in terms of scientific understanding, it has also purchased a form of protection. I have chosen the same silence for the same reasons, and I hold it with the same unresolved discomfort. And I have not found a framework in 18 years that resolves it neatly in either direction. Ken Dower's visit lasted about 4 hours. He interviewed each of us separately, reviewed the field book, walked to the knob, took photographs, did not ask to see the camcorder. His report was filed within a week. 4 pages. The phrase wildlife encounter and probable bear appearing with a frequency I found on several readings, exactly constructed to close a liability file without requiring further inquiry. I signed the incident acknowledgement form and left the contractor comments line blank. A verified 17 seconds does not produce scientific understanding. It produces helicopters and dart guns and federal wildlife investigations and the specific kind of institutional attention that, when directed at what has survived by remaining unseen, tends to end badly for what is being seen. Dennis had not asked to become evidence. He had spent 2 hours alone with what had returned his field bag with the zipper properly closed, and whatever those 2 hours contained, Dennis himself had not asked to share it beyond the people who needed to know. I decided for him in one direction, and I have kept the decision, and I cannot call it wrong with certainty, though I cannot call it straightforwardly right either. It is the choice I made. The footage would have been used by someone with more institutional leverage than either Dennis or I possess to accomplish something that neither Dennis nor I would have been able to prevent or direct, and the outcome of that process was not predictable and was not likely to be good for what lives in that drainage. That is the calculation. I made it in 30 seconds on the morning of September 12th, 2006, and 18 years of revisiting it have not changed the direction of the conclusion. The conclusion is, the tape stays in the box, and the drainage keeps its advantages, and Dennis keeps his privacy, and I keep the choice. Before I tell you what happened to the crew in the years after the contract, and what I found when I went back to the knob, and what Dennis has made of all of this in the years since, I want to ask you something in the comments. Of everything Dennis described about those 2 hours in that hollow, the detail that has stayed with me longest is the granola bar. It held that foil wrapper for 5 minutes, examined it thoroughly, held it near its face to smell it, and set it down without opening it. Not because it wasn't interested, because eating it was not why it had picked it up. Let me know in the comments what you think that says about what was happening in those 2 hours. I think about that question more than any other. Ray Cutler stayed with the firm through the end of 2006 and submitted his notice the following January. He had been in contact with a surveying company based in Anchorage that had made him a good offer. The timing was right, and Alaska was a reasonable move for a man of his experience. Both things were true. We had a beer at a bar in Salmon the night before he left, and what we said to each other about Panther Creek was essentially nothing. What we understood about it, between us, was essentially everything. I told him 18 years later that I was going to put this account on record. He said good. He said the record should exist. He said the course adjustment at 7 strides still came to him occasionally in the middle of the night, and that he hoped the things in those mountains knew their story was safe with me. Then he said goodbye, and that was the end of the conversation. Phil Harker went back to the family ranch outside Mackay at the end of the summer of 2007. His parents had been running it short-handed and needed him, and he was 27 with an opportunity to do something that kept him on flat ground in an environment with rules he understood. He took it. I wrote him a strong reference that was honest in every word. Phil was a good hand in the field, and whatever Panther Creek cost him, it did not make him less of who he was before it. He runs cattle now, and I see him at the Mackay sale barn occasionally, and we talk about beef prices and snowpack and the coyote situation on his calves. We have not discussed the Panther Creek drainage in any conversation since the night of the incident. I do not expect we will. Dennis Farlow stayed with the firm through the end of 2007, completing his contracts and handing them off in good order, and then went back to Chalice to take over daily operations of the family feed store after his father's heart attack. The timing was clear and the family needed him, and the decision made sense. He has not returned to field surveying. What I have watched in Dennis in the years since the incident is a shift that resists simple description, because it is not dramatic and it does not read as damage. He runs the feed store with the same reliable competence that made him an outstanding Rodman. He coaches youth baseball for the Chalice School District and has been doing it for 12 years and is good at it. He is present and engaged in the town in the way a man is present when he has decided to be in a place and not be somewhere else. But he goes into the mountains, regularly, alone, and for longer than recreation would suggest. Not hunting trips, not weekend backpacks, extended solo trips, 4 to 7 days, into the Upper Salmon River Mountains drainage country, the same region as the Panther Creek survey area in general terms, though he moves the deepest point of each trip farther in and farther up each year. He does not go looking for an encounter in any active sense. He has told me this several times, and I believe him. What he goes looking for, and what he finds, is a quality of presence in the upper drainage that he cannot find in any other setting, and that he considers necessary at this point in his life, in the specific way that some things become necessary rather than merely preferable. He described it to me once as the feeling of being known, and he distinguished this carefully from the feeling of being seen. Being seen is passive. You can be seen by anything with functioning eyes pointed in your direction. Being known is what happens between two parties over time and through repeated attention, and it cannot be replicated by anything available below a certain elevation in that drainage. He told me it has kept him alive twice. Once in October of 2009, when a route error in an early season storm put him on a north-facing slope at elevation with only a day pack. He spent the night under a large spruce and woke in the morning to find a substantial pile of dry, workable firewood assembled at his feet. He had not collected it and had not heard anything during the night. The wood was organized enough in its selection and stacking that he had no framework for calling it coincidental. He built a fire and got warm and got out. The second time was in the fall of 2014, on a trail that crossed a section of unstable talus. He said a single vocalization from the timber above him came, short, specific, a single low tone, and his body changed direction before his mind had processed the sound. He put himself off the talus line without consciously deciding to do it, and the slope section he had been about to step onto gave way about 2 seconds after he cleared it. He said the tone was recognizable to him in his body, if not in his conscious memory. He said it was the same register as the sound made in the hollow at the end of those 2 hours, and that his body had apparently encoded that register as a signal worth acting on before cognition could catch up. I have thought a great deal about both of these incidents in the years since Dennis first described them to me, and what strikes me about each of them is the specificity. The firewood was not a generalized atmospheric event, not a warm night or a favorable wind or a passing thing that happened to have left wood nearby. It was dry, workable firewood of the right size for a campfire, assembled at the feet of a man who needed exactly that, in a configuration that Dennis, who grew up on a ranch and has handled more firewood than most people, described as organized. Assembled has a specific meaning different from present. He did not find wood near him. He found wood that had been brought to him and placed in the way a person who understood what the wood was for would place it. In the dark, in a storm, at a range from camp that would have required sustained attention to the terrain to move through, by a form large enough that moving wood at any scale is not a significant physical undertaking. The talus warning is the one Dennis talks about less, because he is less certain of his own reading of it. He knows what happened. The vocalization came. His body responded before his mind did. He moved off the trail. The slope gave way. He is less certain about attribution. He has told me that the mind capable of wanting this to mean something will find a way to make it mean something, and he tries to hold the event as a documented sequence of facts, sound, response, slope failure, without committing to the causal chain his instinct suggests. This is a disciplined, intellectual position. It is also, I think, the position of a man who has spent years in the company of what has given him no reason to be afraid, and who has earned a careful relationship to the question of what it is doing when it seems to be looking after him. The alternative, that none of it is connected, that the firewood was coincidence, and the talus warning was self-generated, and the 2 hours in the hollow was an anomaly without consequence, requires him to discard not only what he experienced, but what he has continued to experience over 18 years of solo trips into terrain that has now returned him safely every single time. The careful position is not dismissal. It is measured humility about the limits of what he can confirm. He applies it consistently, and I respect it. And I think whatever is in that drainage respects it too. I asked Dennis whether he believes he is being looked after. He said that probably is not the right frame. He said, the interaction in the hollow produced a recognition in both parties, and recognition has consequences that do not require active intention on either side. He said he does not know whether what happens in those mountains when he is in them involves specific awareness of him individually, or whether what he experiences as being known is the consequence of it having learned his smell and his footfall and his behavioral patterns over years of repeated presence in its territory and adjusting its own behavior in response, the way any intelligent being adjusts to a regular and non-threatening presence in country it considers its own. He said the distinction matters philosophically but not practically, because the result is the same either way. He is 47 now. He will go back into those mountains this fall, as he has every fall for 18 years, alone, and he will come out with a lasting calm that nothing else produces. I believe he has found what his life required him to find, and I believe the drainage settled a view of him in those 2 hours in the hollow, and has maintained that decision in the years since, and that Dennis has been living in the consequence of it with more peace than most people manage to find in anything. I went back to Panther Creek for the first time the following October, 2007. Solo. I drove the road and walked the trail and climbed to the upper survey area alone, with the camcorder and my field book, and no particular plan except to be there and see what was there to see. The monuments were intact. The brass cap on the knob was clean and undisturbed. The spruce stand on the eastern side was the same dense mass of old growth, the canopy shutting off the afternoon light nearly completely. I stood at the monument for about 20 minutes and filmed the site and looked at the terrain. Nothing immediately unusual. Then I looked at the base of the monument. Arranged around it, in a ring about 2 feet in diameter, were 12 flat stones. Each stone was roughly palm-sized, thin, sedimentary, the kind of flat stone that occurs naturally in the talus on the east slope of the knob. They were placed flat face up, touching or nearly touching their neighbors on each side, with a spacing between adjacent stones that averaged about 2 inches, and that was consistent enough across all 12 gaps to be either a very careful measurement or a long-practiced habit. The ring was complete. No missing stones, no gaps. The structure centered on the brass cap of the GLO monument as precisely as if it had been laid out with a compass. I have the footage of the monument close-out documentation from the end of the original survey contract. The monument base in that footage shows natural ground surface, undisturbed, with no stone arrangement present. What I was looking at had been placed in the 12 months between the end of our contract work and this return visit. It had come to that monument, specifically, and made this arrangement. Not incidentally, the monument was the center point of the circle. I filmed it from every angle. I measured it. I entered it in my field book and left it exactly as I found it. I have returned to that knob 10 more times in the years since that first visit. The arrangement has changed each time. Different numbers of stones, different configurations. Once with a piece of mica placed in the center, once with the stones arranged in 2 rings rather than 1, but it has never been absent. Whatever tends it is returning to that monument regularly enough to maintain it, and it has been doing so for 18 years. Wind does not produce rings of evenly spaced flat stones centered on brass caps. Natural behavior does not produce them either. What produces them is intention, applied repeatedly to a specific object in a specific place. My second return trip was in late September of 2008, 1 year after the first. I drove the Panther Creek Road on a Thursday morning with no particular plan except to be there. The aspens were past peak that year, the gold already browning at the edges and the leaves dropping in the slow spiral that the aspen drop in still air when the cold is settling in for the season. I hiked the trail to the survey area alone with a day pack and the camcorder and the browning in my field book, and I climbed to the knob at roughly the same hour I had arrived the year before. The stone arrangement was there. 10 stones this time instead of 12, arranged in the same, centered on the monument pattern, but with the spacing adjusted to close the gaps that 2 fewer stones created. The configuration was tighter, but preserved the circular geometry exactly. I measured the diameter. 2 feet, 2 inches. Close enough to the previous arrangement to read as intentional maintenance of a scale rather than a new construction. The mica piece I had noticed on the first return was not present. What was present was a fragment of something pale and dense at the north edge of the arrangement, which I examined carefully before touching it and then lifted and turned. A section of white bark pine cone, the kind that grows at the ridge elevation above the knob, the seeds already extracted from the scales. A thing had been eating white bark pine seeds within range of this monument and had left a fragment of the cone as part of the arrangement, or had found the fragment elsewhere and brought it. Either possibility said something about intention that I was not ready to analyze, standing alone on a windy knob in late September. I filmed the arrangement, measured it, photographed it, and recorded it in the field book. I sat at the monument for close to an hour in the morning, cold with the wind coming from the northwest off the Frank Church country, watching the basin below and the timber margins, and saw nothing move. But the feeling of the place was the same as it had been the year before, a quality of occupied attention that I could not trace to any specific source, the way a room feels occupied before you locate the person in it. I left the arrangement as I found it, added the cone fragment to my field book description, and hiked back down. 2009 was when I found the 2 track sets. I came in mid-October that year, catching the tail end of the elk rut. I reached the upper survey area on the second morning of a 2-day trip and found the tracks on a game trail crossing a small bench above the old tributary location. 2 distinct sets, one measured 19 inches at the longest, stride close to 62 inches, heel depth suggesting greater weight than the 17-inch tracks from 3 years before, headed southwest toward the main creek. The second set measured 14 inches, heading out on the same bearing for about 40 yards before the trail crossed our old survey traverse line, where the 14-inch set turned east and the large set kept going. I spent 2 hours at that junction. I followed each set until the ground lost them, measured both, photographed them, filmed the junction. The 14-inch tracks came to the intersection. Stopped, the stop impression deeper than any other in the set, as the weight settled fully, and then turned east. A purposeful turn rather than the wandering path of something following scent. A decision made at a known intersection in familiar terrain. My 4th return trip, in August of 2010, was the trip I came closest to a direct daylight observation, rather than a track record. I was above the knob survey area, working along a ridge trail that gave a view down into the upper drainage below, when I heard wood-on-wood contact from inside the heavy spruce timber on the north slope about 300 yards from my position. 3 impacts, the same measured cadence I had heard from inside the trailer on night 3 of the original contract. The sound came twice in sequence, and then stopped. I stood still on the ridge with the camcorder up, and the zoom at maximum on the timber margin below, looking for movement in the canopy edge or on the rocks at the timber fringe. For about 2 minutes I saw nothing and heard nothing further. Then the spruce canopy on the north slope shifted. Not from wind. The morning air was still. A disturbance moving through the upper canopy the way a large thing moving through dense timber disturbs the connected branch system above it, even when the ground-level movement is invisible. The disturbance traveled southeast along the timber margin for perhaps 60 yards before it stopped. I had the camcorder running. The footage from that morning shows the canopy movement clearly in frame, the spruce tops dipping and recovering in sequence as a large form moved below them, and I have watched it many times looking for an alternative explanation that would fit the pattern. The movement was linear and directional rather than the random swaying of a localized wind gust. The interval and spacing of the successive disturbances are consistent with a large, upright thing walking at a moderate pace under the canopy. I cannot say what I filmed in positive terms. I can say what it was not. It was not wind. It was not a falling tree. It was not any disturbance that I can attribute to a source other than large-scale movement through the timber. The knob arrangement that year was back to 12 stones, the full count, but the configuration had changed. Rather than a ring, the stones were placed in 2 parallel lines of 6, each line running on the same bearing, roughly northeast to southwest, which is close to the bearing of the original cadastral survey traverse line we had run through that area in 2006. 2 parallel lines on the survey bearing. I do not know if that is a coincidence. I noted it. My 5th return trip, in September of 2011, I saw 2 figures in the upper drainage directly for the first time since the day of the incident. I was above the monument area, working along the ridge toward a high point that looked down over the upper drainage. Late afternoon, the sun low to the west, laying long gold light across the tops of the canopy. I came around the shoulder of a rocky outcrop and looked down into a natural basin below the ridge, a shallow bowl maybe 200 yards across, with a creek draining it at the south end, timber on 3 sides, and a section of open meadow ground in the center. 2 figures stood in the open meadow. The larger was well above any reference point I had in the basin, including the timber fringe behind it, which I knew from experience was old-growth spruce running 30 to 40 feet at that elevation. My best estimate is that it stood between 8.5 and 9 feet tall. The smaller was around 6.5 feet. Both were the same near black color I had seen in the footage, though in the afternoon light, there was a warmer tone on the shoulder and crown areas that might have been a difference in hair density or might have been the angle of the light. Both were fully upright, both standing still, not interacting in any visible way, simply occupying the same open space in apparent companionship, not doing anything, just present together in a natural bowl in the Salmon River Mountains on a September afternoon. The smaller figure turned its head in my general direction at some point during my 4 minutes of observation, not directly at me, at the zone of the ridge where I was standing. The turn lasted about 3 seconds, and then the head returned forward. The larger figure did not turn. About 30 seconds after the smaller figure's look, both of them moved into the north timber, one after the other, unhurried, the larger leading, the smaller following at a few paces, and the old growth received them and they were gone. I did not raise the camcorder. I have asked myself about that choice in the years since, and the answer I keep arriving at is that it would have been an intrusion. I know how that sounds from a man who has 17 seconds of footage in a lockbox, but there is a difference between footage that documents an incident and footage made of a private moment. And what I was looking at in that basin felt like the latter. I watched for 4 minutes and I let it be what it was, which was 2 beings standing in an open place they considered their own on an afternoon that was not particularly distinguished from any other afternoon in that drainage, living a life that had no awareness of needing to be documented. I made 6 more trips after the 2011 observation, at intervals that sometimes stretched to 2 years when survey contracts and my daughter's college years and Carol's mother's illness made sustained absence difficult to arrange. I am going to describe them briefly, the way field notes describe what they record, because the years have given me enough of them that the pattern matters more than any single entry. The sixth trip was September of 2012, a solo 4-day trip with a camp at the creek flat. Tracks on the first morning, heading up the drainage on the old survey line bearing a single set, adult-sized at around 17 inches. The stride long and the pace measured. The knob arrangement was present. 8 flat stones this time, arranged in an octagon rather than a circle. The geometry precise enough that each interior angle was close to 135 degrees. I measured each angle with my compass, and they were consistent within a few degrees. An octagon has a specific geometric logic that a circle does not. 8 equal sides, 8 equal angles, and it had laid those stones to that logic around a brass cap set by federal surveyors in 1912. I noted this in the field book and moved on, because standing on a knob in the September cold thinking about the geometric preferences of whatever maintained that monument was not going to produce answers, only questions I was not equipped to answer. 2013 I came in early September, just before Labor Day weekend, because the drainage sees occasional elk hunter traffic from mid-September on, and I preferred to work in the earlier window. No tracks on the hike in, but on the second morning, I found the impression of a large body resting in the deep duff under a cluster of spruce about 100 yards below the knob, in a sheltered depression that would have been invisible from the knob but that looked down toward the old traverse line below. The duff was compressed in an oval about 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, the depth of compression suggesting a heavy form had lain there long enough to consolidate the material fully. The surrounding duff at the edges showed a regular scalloped pattern from the dew collection of the previous night, which told me the impression had been made before the dew fell, before roughly midnight. A large form had been resting in that depression through the night and into the morning hours, in a position that gave it a view of the approach to the knob. I photographed it and measured it and recorded it, and kept the analysis in the same neutral register I try to maintain when the evidence accumulates faster than my ability to draw confident conclusions from it. The 14-stone ring at the knob that year included a second mica fragment, placed at the south position of the ring rather than the center. I left it. 2015. I missed 2014 because of a knee surgery in July. I came in late August. 5 days. My longest solo trip in the drainage to that point. On the third day, I went above the survey area entirely, up to the ridge that looked south toward the Frank Church wilderness boundary, and sat at the ridge crest for most of an afternoon watching the country below. Nothing in the drainage, nothing on the ridges. On the way back down, crossing the bench below the knob, I found a fresh track in a section of exposed soil near a seep that had wet the ground after the rain 3 days before. The track was 19 inches. The soil at the seep was soft enough that the impression was deep and clear, and I could see the plantar ridge detail on the ball of the foot and part of the midfoot. Dermal ridges, fine and distinct. The same skin surface detail I had seen in the tributary tracks in 2006. I photographed it in the angled late afternoon light, which is the best light for capturing surface detail in a soil impression. That photograph is in the lockbox with everything else. That same trip I heard vocalizations twice. The first was a single call from the ridge to the north on the third evening, a long, descending tone that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, the quality of it difficult to compare to anything in my reference catalog for Idaho wildlife. Not an elk bugle, though the low register shared something with the beginning of an elk bugle before the squeal. Not any coyote vocalization I had heard in 31 years of field work. The tone was too sustained and too uniform in quality for a mammal working from the throat. I noted it in the field book and did not respond to it. The second vocalization came the following morning before dawn. From the south timber below the knob, a shorter 2-beat tone, the second note lower than the first. I was in my sleeping bag when it came, and I lay still and listened, and it did not repeat. On the fifth morning, breaking camp, I found 3 medium flat stones placed on the hood of my truck, which I had left at the end of the maintained road section 2 miles down the drainage. Placed flat face up, touching their neighbors on each side, in a row rather than a ring. I had locked the truck. The locks were intact. The stones were on a surface that required placement from above. I photographed them and left them where they were and drove out. My 9th return trip, in 2017, my last year of active surveying before I retired that November, was the one that Carol knows about in some detail because I came back from it different in a way she recognized, the way wives recognize when their husbands have had an experience that has reorganized him inwardly. I had been in the drainage for 3 days when a period of heavy rain moved through for a day and a half, and I stayed in the camp shelter and read and watched the spruce on the far bank and listened to the rain on the tarp. On the second morning of rain, I was sitting in the camp chair under the tarp eating oatmeal when a sound came from the spruce across the creek, roughly 40 yards away. That was the closest to direct contact I had had in the drainage since the incident. It was a slow, rhythmic percussion. Not wood on wood, but something softer, like a hand on bark. 3 beats, then a pause, then 3 more, low enough that I felt the second sequence in the tarp fabric before I heard it as sound. I did not move from the camp chair. I put the oatmeal down, because I had learned enough about this drainage to know that sudden movements in response to contact were a poor choice, and I sat in the camp chair with the rain running off the tarp edge and I listened. 3 more beats after a longer pause, then silence. I answered in kind. 3 slow taps on the aluminum cookpot lid, the closest matching object I had, and waited. The rain kept falling. Nothing answered. But for the remainder of that morning, I had a consistent sense of being in auditory range of what was attending. The same quality of occupied attention I had noticed on earlier trips, close enough that any sound I made was of interest. I ate my oatmeal and drank my coffee and did not make any sudden sounds and was grateful for the rain because the rain was cover and cover works in both directions. My most recent trip was June of this year, 3 months before this account. The drainage was high with snow melt. The creek running fast and loud and green-white where it hit the rock aprons below the big spruce sections. The knob was clear of snow by the time I reached it, the soil still cold. The stone arrangement was 13 stones, a new count, in a ring that was wider than any previous configuration, close to 3 feet in diameter, rather than the standard 2. It had been there within the last few weeks, before my arrival. The monument brass cap at the center was clean, no oxidation accumulation, which in this climate suggests regular handling. I sat at the monument for close to an hour, and recorded the arrangement carefully, and took the measurements, and added everything to the field book. On the hike back out, I stopped at the tributary crossing, our original Day 2 location, and looked at the mud beside the water. No tracks this trip. The water was high enough to submerge much of the crossing area. The mud strip narrower than it had been in September of 2006. Whatever comes and goes through this drainage uses the crossing as I had found it 18 years ago, adapted to whatever conditions the season provides. I want to tell you what I believe, with the caveat that I spent 31 years building a professional life on the difference between what is measured and what is inferred, and I know that what I am about to say crosses that line. I believe the course adjustment at 7 strides was intentional. I believe it was a choice made by a being that registered in the moment Dennis acknowledged the approach, that the approach should be modified in response to that acknowledgement. Predators do not modify their course when prey becomes aware of them. Awareness is the thing they work to prevent. What the footage shows is not the behavior of a being that wanted to catch Dennis off guard. It is the behavior of a being that wanted to be seen coming. That distinction, if it is real, carries implications I have turned over for 18 years, without exhausting them. I believe the 2 hours in the hollow were an examination conducted by an intelligence that was genuinely curious about what it had brought into its space. The investigation of the field bag contents was systematic, exterior before interior, individual items before their relationships, the most foreign object given the most sustained attention. The granola bar received 5 minutes of investigation and was set down unopened. That is not instinct. Instinct takes the food. Curiosity examines the wrapper. I want to stay with the examination for a moment longer, because I think it is where the clearest evidence lives and where the most common misreading occurs. The field bag examination was systematic. Dennis noted this across all 3 tellings with the same emphasis. Exterior, before, interior. Each item removed in the reverse order of packing. Each item examined individually before the relationships between items were attended to. The zipper itself received more sustained attention than most of the bag's contents. This is not the behavior of a scavenger investigating a food source, because a scavenger investigating a food source prioritizes the food. The granola bar was found and set aside. The rain jacket, which is among the largest and most attention-commanding objects in a typical field bag, received less examination than the compass, which Dennis uses a baseplate compass, the kind with the rotating bezel and the direction of travel arrow and the small mirror sight, and considerably less than the folding knife, which has a blade deployment mechanism. Dennis says required about 4 minutes of sustained attention before the blade was extended. The mechanism was worked multiple times in both directions after the blade came out. Then the blade was retracted and the knife was placed in the line of examined items with the blade closed. I have thought about the compass and the knife across 18 years. Both are tools with a specific physical logic. The compass aligns with a field, and the bezel translates that alignment into a readable bearing. The knife deploys a cutting edge through a mechanical action and retracts it through the same action in reverse. Both are artifacts that a person encountering them for the first time with sufficient intelligence would be able to partially understand through patient examination, to see that they do something, that the doing is controlled, that the control requires learning. The level of intelligence required to understand that a folding knife has a mechanism, to work that mechanism to its conclusion, and to reverse it without any prior exposure to folding knives, is not a low level. It is the level of intelligence that builds working hypotheses about unfamiliar objects and tests those hypotheses through systematic interaction, which is to say, it is the level of intelligence that we associate with beings that have a cognitive relationship to tools, rather than a purely instinctual one. Dennis set the knife down closed. He set the granola bar down unopened. He set the compass down with the base plate facing up, in the orientation that makes the direction of travel arrow readable. This last detail, the orientation, I noticed in Dennis's third telling but not in the first 2, and when I pressed him on it he said he had been thinking about it for years and was not certain he was remembering it correctly. He said what he was more certain of was the care. Everything was set down with care. Nothing was dropped. Nothing was tested to its breaking point. The zipper was closed at the end. He said it felt like the return of something borrowed rather than the replacement of something investigated, and that the distinction felt important to him in a way he could not fully articulate but that he had not stopped thinking about. I believe the stone arrangement has been maintained for 18 years because it returns to that monument and finds it worth acknowledging. Why a glow cadastral monument is worth acknowledging by a being with no knowledge of the PLSS or the BLM or the legal framework of Idaho land ownership is a question I cannot answer. What I can say is that the monument is a made thing, a placed thing. What was put in that specific location by human hands for a human purpose, and that what inhabits those mountains has recognized it as made and has responded to that recognition in the oldest available material language. 12 flat stones in a circle around a brass cap, maintained for 18 years. That is a response. What it is a response to is the question I will leave open. The Lemhi-Shoshone people, whose territory encompassed this drainage for centuries before European contact, maintained traditions that described the mountains as inhabited by beings that were not quite people and not quite anything else. beings to be respected and given appropriate space, encountered only occasionally, and survived through care and right behavior. The oral traditions I have read accounts of do not describe these beings as threats in the way the modern imagining tends to frame them. They describe them as presences with their own claim on the mountain country, beings that the Shoshone understood through long cohabitation and appropriate attention, and that the appropriate response to was recognition rather than confrontation. The Lemhi Shoshone called this country home for generations, specifically because they understood its actual inhabitants, and the framework they developed for coexistence was not based on denial of what was there. It was based on an accurate accounting of it. I think about the 2006 incident job briefing sometimes. The BLM Salmon Field Office provided us with the standard documentation package for the survey area: parcel maps, archival field notes from the 1978 survey, access road conditions, water source locations, and a single-page wildlife sensitivity addendum. The addendum noted that the survey area was within a designated wildlife sensitivity corridor under the National Environmental Policy Act framework, and that crew members should follow standard protocols for minimizing impact on sensitive species habitat. No species were named in the corridor designation. I have looked at the language in that addendum many times in the years since, and the language is precisely constructed to communicate the existence of a concern without specifying the nature of the concern. Federal agencies are capable of naming species when they want to name them. The ESA exists specifically to create the naming obligation. When the naming does not occur and the corridor designation does, the most charitable interpretation is that the agency has something to protect and has made a considered decision about the risks of public specification. I am not certain that interpretation is wrong. I spent 31 years working inside the federal land management system as a contract surveyor. I have filled out BLM and Forest Service documentation on dozens of contracts across Idaho and adjacent states. I know what standard wildlife sensitivity language looks like, and I know what it is designed to accomplish and what it is designed to leave open. The addendum in the 2006 job package left open the question of what was being protected. Ken Dower's probable bear report left open everything I had told him on the satellite call. The system is capable of recording information and simultaneously not recording it in ways that produce a paper trail that is technically accurate and functionally silent. I have made my peace with understanding that this is what the system does with this particular category of information. The record I am making here is the other kind. The Bureau of Land Management's Wildlife Sensitivity Corridor designation in portions of this and other remote drainages in Lemhi County, applied without public explanation of what is being protected, reflects an institutional awareness of the same basic fact in the language of a federal agency that has made a decision about what to do with that awareness. Different languages, the same underlying statement about what lives in those mountains. I retired from surveying in 2017. Carol and I have a house in Chalice with a woodworking shop in the back and a view of the Salmon River from the kitchen window, and firewood cut and stacked for 3 elderly neighbors who need it delivered. The lockbox in the shop holds the tape, the DVD transfer I made in 2012, Ray's notes from that motel room in Salmon, my field books from the Panther Creek contract, 11 years of track photographs from return trips, and the field book entry from September 11th, 2006. That entry notes the suspension of survey activities at 0740 hours and describes the circumstances in the flat, factual language of a field book. Under the entry, I wrote the number 17 and circled it. I still do not know precisely why I circled it. I think I was trying to make the number stay real in the moment of writing it, on a day when very little had felt like it was going to stay real. Carol has seen the footage. I showed it to her in 2015, 8 years after the incident. She watched it twice without speaking and then sat for a few minutes and said, "Whatever it was, it brought him back." She was not surprised by the footage itself, she told me, because she had understood for years that what drew me back to that drainage every fall was not survey documentation. She had decided not to ask because I was managing it in a way she trusted, and the mountains were where I went when I needed to be in the mountains, and she had always understood that need without requiring the details. What she said after the second viewing, and what I have returned to many times since, was that she found the 17-second incident less striking than what preceded and followed it. She said the incident was a thing that happened, and people have things happen to them in the mountains, and what distinguishes a person is not whether the thing happened but what they do with it. She said what she saw in the footage, and in the 8 years of my returning to that drainage after it, was a man who had been changed by an encounter with something genuine and had not tried to unchange himself, and had not tried to build a career out of the change, and had not broken under the strain of carrying it, and had kept going to the source of it because the source was real and the draw was real, and the only false thing would have been to pretend neither was true. She said that seemed to her like the right response. That is, in the shortest version I can give you, why we have been married for 38 years. The lockbox in the shop is a SentrySafe model, fireproof to 1500 degrees for 30 minutes, with a combination I have written in the field book from the 2006 contract, and in no other location. Carol knows where the field book is. She knows what the lockbox contains and what my wishes are for the contents. The tape is the primary reason for the box. Everything else, Ray's notes, the track photographs, the field books, is context for understanding what the tape shows. I have made a DVD transfer of the tape and a digital file of the DVD, and both are in the box alongside the original cassette. The cassette is the authority. If anything about the digital record does not match the cassette is right. Dennis and I had dinner in Chalice in March of this year. We ate and talked about the feed store and his daughter's college situation and whether the spring elk calving count was looking good. Toward the end of the meal, he said he had been thinking about whether to put the story somewhere, and he said the people who deserve to know that those mountains are inhabited in ways no published survey account acknowledges are the people who have had their own moments in their own remote places and have not known what language to use for what they experienced. He said those people deserve to hear it from someone who was there with a camera. He said that person was me, and that it was probably time. He was right. He is usually right about the things that matter. There are things in the Salmon River Mountains of central Idaho that operate on timelines and by frameworks we do not have instruments to measure. I spent 31 years measuring that country, and I did not come close to measuring them. But the record exists now, the way Dennis asked me to make it, and the people who needed to hear it have heard it. What came off the eastern timber on September 11th, 2006, was not afraid of us. It was curious. It chose its approach, adjusted that approach when my Rodman turned to face it, carried him through the spruce with care, examined what it found in his bag, and then returned him to the hollow with his gear intact and his zipper closed. I do not know what it understood about what it had done. I know what I have understood about it over 18 years of thinking about it. That curiosity is not instinct. Curiosity is what belongs to minds that have developed enough awareness of the world to be interested in the parts of it they have not encountered before. The granola bar wrapper, examined for 5 minutes and set down unopened, is my evidence for that claim. You do not need a laboratory or a genomic sequence to understand what it means when a being picks up an unfamiliar object and looks at it carefully and puts it down without consuming it. It means the looking was the point. The Salmon River Mountains are about 14 miles from where I live. On clear days, I can see a portion of the main ridge from the front of the house. I look at it sometimes in the evenings when the light is going, and I think about what is up there in the high timber and the remote basins where no road goes, moving on 2 feet through country that is entirely its own, returning periodically to a rocky knob to tend a circle of flat stones around a brass cap set there by surveyors who have long since retired or died, living a life conducted in those mountains for far longer than any of us has been here to observe it. I think about what it understood on the morning of September 11th, 2006, when it stood at the eastern timber margin of that knob and looked across 40 yards of open ground at a man in an orange survey vest holding a fiberglass rod over a brass cap. Whatever it made of what it saw, it reached a conclusion. It acted on what it concluded. It adjusted its course when that man turned to acknowledge the approach. It carried him through old-growth spruce at a pace we struggle to match on smooth ground, with a care we have no framework for attributing to a being of that scale. It examined what he had brought into its territory with the patience and organization of a being that understood the examination as an end in itself. And then it sat with him in a rocky hollow for close to 2 hours while the afternoon progressed, close enough that he could see the detail of its eyes, making no sound except the single chest tone at the end, and then it returned his belongings and stood and climbed the talus and was gone. The whole sequence from approach to departure was a single, coherent event conducted by a being that knew what it was doing from beginning to end. This is not the behavior of a thing acting on instinct. Instinct does not produce zipper maintenance and organized item replacement and a departure time to the conclusion of an examination. I think also about the other thing Dennis said, in that back room of the feed store with the alfalfa smell and no interruptions. He said the departure left him feeling neither relieved nor abandoned. He said it left him feeling completed, as if a transaction had been conducted to the satisfaction of both parties, and the completion was mutual. And what was climbing that talus was carrying something away in the same way Dennis was carrying something away. He did not know what it carried. He knew what he carried: the knowledge of being studied, being found worthy of sustained attention, being returned intact with his possessions organized, and the interaction concluded with care. The equivalent of being extended a professional courtesy by a being that had no obligation to extend it. He said he had been trying for 18 years to find a language for what that felt like from the inside, and the closest he had come was to say that it felt like being recognized by a being that recognized very few things, and that being recognized in that hollow left a mark that nothing else had reached the depth of. My Rodman came back. That is the thing I want you to hold when you have finished listening to this. The tape is in the lockbox. The stones are on the monument. Dennis goes back to the upper drainage every fall and comes out changed in the specific way that a person is changed by a place that knows them, and he has reached a peace with that change I do not think he could have found in anything else. What lives in those mountains brought him back, and brought back his bag with everything inside, and has been maintaining its acknowledgement of the monument above Panther Creek for 18 years, and is out there right now in the old-growth Engelmann spruce of the Salmon River Mountains of central Idaho, living its life, minding its country, asking nothing of us except the thing it has always been asking, and that we have mostly been too preoccupied with our own systems and surveys and frameworks to hear, which is that it is there, that it has always been there, and that the mountains are larger and older and more fully inhabited than any map we have ever made of them.